We do have Daniel Harris. Daniel Harris, can you actually lift the gloom in this? It was a rather grim morning this morning. Got into the taxi at 6:20. It was really, really dark. It was raining, and the last thing I wanted, which I got, was a chirpy taxi driver. But he hates Man United.
So some you win, some you lose.
Yeah, I lost this one, but he gave me his life story in 10 minutes, gave out about the government, praised the government, and basically said Man United are crap, and he was definitely right about the last one.
Yeah, there's no getting away from that. The performance yesterday was absolutely shite, I guess, and not for the first time. There is some level of defence in that Solskjaer was missing, I think, 6 of the players that started against Chelsea, and in a squad that is already underpowered, understaffed, and lacking in quality. If you're missing 3 of the first choice back 4, and Pogba and Martial, that is going to be a problem. But I think the problem more is that there's no apparent plan. And there's a lot of whys after the event, people who were saying, well, he should never have got the job in the first place and he just got a post-Mourinho bounce. But I don't actually think that's necessarily true, in that if you watched United for the first bit of Solskjaer's reign as manager when things were going well, it wasn't just a matter of players playing with freedom. It was that he was going into specific games with specific plans, and those plans were working. And he was making good substitutions, and he was making good adjustments in the middle of the game. Like against Tottenham, he did it. Against Southampton at home, he did it. Against Palace away, he did it. Against PSG, most famously, he did it. But watching them now, it's not at all obvious what the idea is, apart from hope for a counter. And the teams that he's picking, he keeps making the same mistakes over and over again. And part of that is that, as I said, he doesn't have enough players in the squad. That's probably not his fault. It's probably the fault of the Glazers. And ideally, we'd just sit here and we'd talk about football and what we saw on the pitch. But it's not possible to talk about Manchester United without talking about what is now for 14 years of the club being pillaged for over £1 billion. And that is the root of all of this. And it will always be the root of all of this. So every time we talk about it, I'm always going to say that. But there are other problems, and the lack of an apparent plan, the lack of any apparent tactics, and the constant picking of players who aren't cutting it. So you watch Juan Mata play for United, and I would say pound for pound, he's probably one of the most disappointing signings that United have ever made. Actually, pound for pound is probably not the right way of ranking him. It's more what we thought we were getting and what we ended up getting. He's just had very few good games, and almost all of the good games he's had have come at Old Trafford. And when you play him away from home, particularly when you play him in the middle and it gets congested, he looks like a child playing with his dad's mates. And I'm not sure what Solskjaer expected to be different by picking him yesterday. And I do feel for Solskjaer that the other option is picking young players. And you don't want to bring young players into this kind of environment, but at least you might get some freshness. And at least you get the pleasure of not knowing. Whereas when you watch the likes of Mata and Matic, who he didn't play yesterday, when you watch them play, you know it's going to be rubbish. There's no, perhaps it won't be, you know that is what is going to happen.
You've mentioned the Glazers again there before we get back to Solskjaer, and even the De Gea interview afterwards. And I think the last time I was on the show with you, you mentioned the Glazers. If you keep mentioning the Glazers, and it's part of this narrative that basically, in tune with what Jeremy Corbyn was actually saying yesterday in terms of the way football clubs are being run now, does it come to a point where Manchester United's fan base has a sufficient backbone and kind of a wherewithal about it to start some sort of a revolt against the regime? Because, the words you use, like pillaging, evoking, some sort of basically taking money off a beautiful football club for profit and not really being all that bothered about how things go on the pitch. So how are the fans still okay with this?
People aren't okay with it, but the bond with the football club is an emotional thing. And it's, for a lot of people, it's passed down for generations. It's part of their life. It's what they do. And chucking that in is problematic. The truth is that the opportunity has probably been missed now. In 2005, if enough people hadn't renewed their season tickets, or the, I guess what you might call civil disobedience had continued, then perhaps the Glazers would have got cold feet. I mean, what really needed to happen in 2005 was Alex Ferguson needed to say, I will not work for these people, and that would have been enough. The banks wouldn't have lent the money. And let's be under no misapprehensions, Fergie knew that. And I mean, there are people who know more about this than I do who are on record as saying Fergie discussed it at a meeting with supporter representatives. He, in the end, decided not to do that. And what he actually delivered, dastardly genius that he is, was United's the most successful period in United's history. But the only way at the time was if people hadn't renewed their season tickets and people hadn't gone to games, enough people, then the Glazers would have had to have gone because they were reliant on that for money. But probably the biggest change in football since the Glazers took over is that bums on seats are no longer the premier source of revenue. And actually, it's now TV money, and that's going to keep coming. Now, of course, TV money is also contingent on United being good and on full stadiums and that kind of thing. But what we saw this summer told you that for the Glazers, they're not now even bothered about United getting into the top four, because the players that they let go versus the players that they signed, you looked at it and you thought, well, if things go really well, then United could make the top four, but it was far from a given. And if United had signed 2 midfield players, then you might have looked at it and thought, actually, there's a pretty good chance United would be odds on to get into the top four at this point. The Glazers decided not to spend that money, and that tells you that they're not interested in getting into the top four, which is interesting. And well, interesting is probably not the right word that I'm looking for, actually. But let's stick with interesting because it's early in the morning. But previously, you could understand from a financial perspective that the Glazers weren't that bothered about winning the league, because in order to win the league, you have to speculate a lot of money. The money that you actually gain from winning the league is relatively small, and it's not a sure thing. So if United go and spend £100 million, let's say, an extra £100 million on transfers, there's still a fair chance that Liverpool or Manchester City win the league. And whereas if you speculate to get into the top four, that's a lot of money you're able to earn by being in the Champions League. So in general, that has been the business plan, Champions League qualification. But the Glazers failing to spend this summer told you that actually they weren't even that asked about getting into the Champions League, because they didn't spend the money that would enable United to have a pretty good shot at doing that. So things are now very different. And the truth is under the Glazers, unless they hire a genius manager, or unless they produce a remarkable amount of their own players, then things are going to get worse, not better.
Yeah, you've been in great form this morning, Daniel. Pillage, arse and shite already in your repertoire, and I think that those 3 words kind of sum up the situation. Meanwhile, in Liverpool, they're 8 points clear, despite, to my mind, actually not even really playing that well at the moment.
Yeah, well, what you've got with Liverpool, and you've seen it, and it's very obvious to see. I'll tell you who they remind me of. They remind me of the France team in 1998 that won the World Cup without actually playing very well all that often. Which isn't to say Liverpool didn't play well all that often, but the France team in 1998 that won the World Cup was not a great team. They're a team that had a great back four in Zidane, more or less. But after they won the World Cup, the confidence that they took from winning that World Cup elevated them a level. And I was actually expecting to see that from the recent France team that won the World Cup, and that hasn't happened. But what we've seen with Liverpool is winning the Champions League and coming so close to winning the league has actually made them into a different team this season. So they turn up to games expecting to win. When they don't play well, they find a way to win. And when they do play well, they also win. And I've seen it, we've all seen it over 20 years with Alex Ferguson's team, the confidence that you get from winning. And we're seeing that from Liverpool. And 8 points is a long way back now for City. Of course, City could beat Liverpool twice, and then that takes the deficit to a manageable 2 points. But what I would say is if City drop points before Liverpool next drop points, then it will be quite close to over, because it's quite hard to see what's going to happen to Liverpool that's going to make them collapse. I mean, teams do collapse when you don't expect them to, but I think the experience of coming so close last year will be good for them, because what happened with Liverpool last year was, and it sounds a weird thing to say when they got so many points, but they did still kind of bottle the league. And I say that
very harsh.
No, let me explain. I know it's harsh, but let me explain. Liverpool got in front of City in February, and then at the end of January, the beginning of February, and they had 3 games around that time, and they, in my opinion, watching those, they didn't just not play well in those games. They got nervous and they bottled them. The game away to Manchester United, at home to Leicester, and at home to West Ham, away to West Ham. And in those 2 latter games, they had a goal lead, and they didn't quite know what to do. They conceded an equaliser, and then they played with nervousness and with fear. And although they rebounded brilliantly, and I was on here saying City will now go and win the league by 6-7 points, because that was what I thought was going to happen. But Liverpool rebounded brilliantly. But it doesn't change the fact that when they got ahead and when they had the advantage, the nervousness with which they played was a big factor in them not getting the points that they needed, and it cost them. And again, when I reiterate this, they rebounded brilliantly, and the run that they went on to the end of the season and to win European Cup was exceptional. But I still felt that when they had that moment to press home the advantage, the nerves got the better of them. And it's not the first club we've seen it with. We saw it with Manchester United when they bottled the league again in 1992, when they had the advantage and then they couldn't score the goals that were necessary to win the league. And that was what happened with Liverpool. Just happened a bit earlier in the season than we're used to. And even though it took a brilliant run from Manchester City to burn them off, it was still that nervousness that cost them. But what we're seeing with Liverpool now is a team that absolutely does not look like that is what is going to happen. And it's true that an injury to Virgil van Dijk or an injury to Sadio Mane or Mohamed Salah, and they would have a problem again. But provided they have a fair run with injuries, then it doesn't really look like that's going to happen. So I think already Manchester City are in a position where they will need to win both the head-to-heads, and they will also need to do something about their defence. And it's very hard to see that happening. And similarly with United, you look at United's squad and say, well, there's no midfield there, and this team is going to struggle. You looked at City's defence and thought that defence itself already isn't a good defence, and that's why they went out in Europe. That's why they keep going out in Europe at the knockout stages, because eventually you play a good team and with a good attack, and you can't dominate the ball to the extent that you can protect your defence. And that's why City lost to Spurs, because they defended badly in both games. And then Aymeric Laporte got injured, and they don't have a replacement. I mean, they don't really even have a credible partner for him, never mind a replacement. And with a long-term injury like that, it's going to cost you points. And it will always be the case that if you have high-level players, losing them will cost you points, and it will particularly cost you points if you don't have any kind of replacement. And I mean, if you imagine, for example, City's defence playing against City's attack in training, I mean, I shudder to think about what must happen there. And the thing with Pep Guardiola, and this is a problem that has dogged his career to a certain extent, and I mean, we're obviously talking relatively because no real problems have dogged the career of the best coach's generation. But when the brilliant Barcelona team that he had is the greatest club side I've ever seen, their defence wasn't that good. The problem was that they had the greatest midfield ever, probably, in front of them, and perhaps the greatest player ever in Messi in front of them, and it was almost impossible to get hold of the ball. So he could play Javier Mascherano at centre-back, and it wouldn't really matter in almost any game against any team because the dominance and possession was such that you couldn't do anything about it. Then he tried the same thing at Bayern Munich with Javi Martinez, and it worked domestically because he had the best team and the most money and the best players. But eventually, it caught up with him in Europe, and he never won the Champions League with Bayern Munich because he could dominate possession, but he couldn't dominate possession to the same extent, and he also didn't have a genius up front. And you've seen it again in Manchester City now, where they've been beaten by Monaco, they've been beaten by Liverpool, and they've been beaten by Tottenham. And they were better than all of those teams. And over the course of the season, you'd expect them to get more points than all of those teams. But he didn't have... His midfield is great, but it's not good enough to dominate possession to the extent where you can protect an iffy defence. And in the end, you need a defence where, unless you have Busquets, Xavi, and Iniesta in midfield, your defence needs to be there mainly to defend, not to give these players quality ball. And we saw it at Manchester City before Son scored in the first leg of their game against Tottenham last season. He took 7 consecutive touches in the City penalty area before, and then scored. Proper defence just doesn't allow that to happen. They conceded, what was it? Was it 2 goals, 3 goals in the first 15 minutes of that game of the second leg at home? A proper defence doesn't allow that to happen. They conceded 3 goals in 20 minutes against Liverpool the previous season in the quarter-final of the European Cup. A proper defence does not allow that to happen. And they've been getting away with it domestically, but as I said, Laporte is probably one injury too many.
One word, 2020 vision, who wins the league?
Liverpool.
Yeah, because obviously it was only one word, but I think you might be right on this one, Daniel. Great to talk to you.
No worries, see you again.